Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Earl Anthony Wayne, who is Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department. How are you, sir? Welcome back to Berkeley.
Well, thanks very much, Harry. It's a pleasure to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
In Concord, California, not far from here. Grew up and came here after high school for my undergraduate years.
And looking back, before we talk about how Berkeley affected you, looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world? Did they leave you with an international orientation that Berkeley then shaped?
Well, they did to a degree. My mother was a opera singer and a music teacher, but she loved things international. And so to the degree that we would go over to San Francisco and explore pretty regularly all the different ethnic communities there, and had many books in our house about things international. And they got me collecting stamps of international stamps. All of that sort of led to an interest in things international.
And was it inevitable that you would come to Berkeley?
Well, you know, sometimes how high school students are, they focus on maybe one option and stay with that. I did take a tour around as a high school junior to all the schools in California, but the one that I liked most was Berkeley, and so in the end I only applied to Berkeley.
Aha. And that was an easier thing to do back then, I guess. I mean, was Berkeley easier to get into, although, you know, comparatively speaking?
Well, you know, I don't remember what I thought through exactly, but I liked Berkeley. I had pretty good grades, and I actually got a scholarship, which was the tremendous sum of something like $250 a year, and that paid for all the tuition and a big chunk of the book costs. So to me, that was just wonderful.
And I think today that might cover the public transportation
Maybe.
from Concord to Berkeley. What did you major in here at Berkeley?
In political science.
Uh-huh.
It was a great time to be here, a pretty exciting time.
These would have been what years now?
1968 to 1972.
So after the first wave of the free speech movement had happened and the Vietnam War was heating up.
Yes, in fact, the first year I was here, we had a different strike each quarter. One was about Angela Davis, and one was Eldridge Cleaver, and I don't remember the third, but for a freshman, it was pretty exciting stuff to come into this atmosphere.
And any professors that you had in political science that you remember and that influenced you?
Well, I was very interested in China. And so there was a young professor there who's since moved on, who sort of helped a bit along the way. His name was John Starr.
Oh, I knew him, yeah.
And Mr. Greger, A. James Greger.
Yes.
Teaching about
yeah.
totalitarianism and dictatorship and communism. It was a fascinating set of courses I took with him. And then there was an adjunct professor whose name was Martic, who was from Yugoslavia, and we did some small group studies on sort of the dynamics of revolutions. And that was very interesting because it got me thinking about change in other societies, the possibilities for peaceful change or the lack of possibilities for peaceful change, which sometimes led to the evolution of violent change. And of course a lot of other ones, Hannah Pitkin and some political theory courses and American politics courses. It was a great time to be here.
And I asked this a number of people who come through this program. Looking back, how do you think the 60s generally shaped your thinking about the world, and of course being at Berkeley?
Well, I'd say that it really opened my perspectives coming from a small suburban city it opened the door on thinking of the great thinkers through history, but also to the dynamics of other cultures and other political systems. And it was sort of like cracking that door open a little bit for me, and made me want to go further.
And then you went on and did graduate work in the East, right? Where did you get your advanced degrees?
Well, I first went to Stanford for a year, and then in political science, but then I decided that no, I really needed to go back east because I knew the California outlook and I would benefit from another experience. So I went back to Princeton in a PhD program, but only went through the exams, and then decided that I'd like to try diplomacy. So I'd taken the Foreign Service exam, and they offered me a job, and so I decided, well, let's see what this is like in action.
And so I guess the next question is, so what have you found after all these years in the Foreign Service? What does it take to do well what you do? If you were trying to explain the common themes in all the different settings that you've worked. We will talk about this in a minute, but you've worked in Europe, you've worked in the National Security Council, you're now working economic matters in the State Department. What are the common modalities that students should understand if they're interested in going into this kind of work?
Well, I think one aspect that's very important is understanding the factors that are affecting what your interlocutor can do. What are the pressures? What are the resources or the lack thereof that he has or she has? And also what is success for him or for her? And then to have clearly in your own mind that same basis, and then see, is there a way that you can find some commonality or not? And try and, if you can find that, try and work that way. And sometimes you have to be very creative to find that, and other times, once you understand the dynamics, you can pretty quickly see where you can get. And then it's easier to try and find the way to get there. And the same thing happens within government. It's very important within a government administration to build a coalition behind a policy that you think can achieve America's objectives, and you try and do that. And similarly, often in working with others, that's what you're trying to do, is to get a coalition to support the good outcome, in this case, for the United States.
You're suggesting what the books tell us about foreign policy, namely that the sets of negotiations are within the U.S. government in preparation or side by side with the negotiation with foreign governments, really.
It often is. I mean, of course, it depends. There's some policy where you know where you're going, there's complete consensus, and then you're just getting the coalition of other countries together, and you're trying to find that common ground. But there are others where you're debating the best way forward at the same time internally as you're working with your partners. That's a little bit more challenging.
And I'm curious, what you had a lot of academic training, and I'm curious as to where the theory doesn't account for the practice. In other words, another way to say this is, what surprised you most as through the years you rolled up your sleeve and did this work that the political science textbooks, the public policy textbooks hadn't prepared you for?
I guess I would say that you really need to understand human dynamics, the dynamics of groups, the dynamics of pressures and interests within groups. And a lot of times our theoretical texts in political science just don't do that satisfactorily. The one book that I really did use a lot from my political science work previously was The Essence of Decision by Graham Allison, because it got you out of thinking everybody was working rationally. It made you think about bureaucratic politics. It made you think about interest group politics and the interaction of personality with that. And that was very helpful for me as I looked at China or as I looked at Europe or any other part of the world. But I had the opportunity after about 7 years to go back to school, and I went back to the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard. And I took courses that focused on negotiations, on leadership, and on bureaucratic politics, because that's what I'd seen that I didn't quite fully understand in my first 7 years, and it proved extremely useful as I was then going forward and again engaged in negotiation with people both in Washington but also around the world.
In your work and in these various assignments that you've had, I guess America's very important role in the world, the responsibilities it has as leader of well, I guess now we would say the democracies, whereas in the Cold War, the West primarily, and so on. Talk a little about that. I mean, how does that impact on the negotiations that you have, and has that been changing? I think I would imagine that when you started your career, you know, America's preeminence was much more obvious than it is today in a much more complex world. Or am I wrong? I mean, is it still the same?
Well, I think in some ways it seemed a lot simpler when we had the Cold War, because you knew who your adversaries were, you knew who your clear allies were, and then there was an undecided area of the world, and often you would compete in that area of the world. Now, it was really more complicated than that, because we had differences in our own camp, there were differences in the Soviet Union's camp, and there were a lot of different actors in the third area. But you did have a framework that you could work in and you could think through. And then what happened when the Cold War ended is we had to rethink what it meant for the United States to be the preeminent power. And we started learning that it wasn't just the preeminent political power, it was also the preeminent economic power. And surprisingly, as it changed, our interlocking ties with the rest of the world became more important to us. They certainly became more important economically. And so personally, I started discovering during this period of the early 1990s and through the 1990s that economics had to be a much more central part of our international policy than it had been before. Now we weren't just dealing with our friends and partners that way. We were dealing with everybody in the world. We were selling more, we were buying more. Information technology was changing the way we were interacting economically, but of course also just in the sharing of information about democracy, about freedom of speech, about secrets, about non-secrets. And it was really changing the way we were thinking, or it had to change the way we were thinking. As usual, there was a little bit of a lag. But that was a lot of what the 1990s was about adapting, in a sense, to this new paradigm of international politics.
And in this period, as I recall from your vita, your portfolio dealt a lot with Europe, where a lot of the action was both in terms of the breakup of Yugoslavia, but also all the steps that Europe was going through to create a European Union that could not only cooperate with the United States, but could also compete with the United States. I mean, clearly that was part of that. Talk a little about that and the evolution, as you saw it from that base, and then we'll move into 9/11, of European attitudes toward the United States. Because in this context, no longer needing the U.S. Vis-a-vis the Soviets, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, really a lot was going on there.
No, there was a lot going on. Because at the same time as we were evolving in our role, as you say, Europe was defining a new way forward, a closer set of political and economic relations between them. And in part, it's my work on Europe that made me understand why economics was more important to the United States too. Because Europe was our largest trading and investment partner, not just trading partner, and that was one of the that's one of the defining characteristics. It's not just that when you trade with somebody, you have a certain amount of a relationship, but when you invest in each other's economies and you have each other's citizens, 3 or 4 million of them on each side of the Atlantic, working for your companies, quote unquote, it changes things a bit. And so I came to realize that this relationship with Europe was political, it was cultural, of course, but it was also innately economic in a way that tied us together. Now, at the same time, as you say, it was more complicated because Europe was trying to define a way forward to change from an economic community to a union, a European Union that was both more integrated economically but also more integrated politically. And that meant a more integrated foreign policy. Now, as we all know, this didn't happen overnight. But they were trying the way. They were trying to define their own policy, and sometimes that meant they bumped up against us, or we bumped up against them. And we had to work out new ways of discussing foreign policy issues, crises, trade issues, investment issues, and try to have frameworks for that to go forward. The biggest one we ran up against, you mentioned, which was the breakup of the former Yugoslavia during that period. The most trying one, the one where I think in retrospect we would all say we made some mistakes. We didn't handle it as well as we would have. But through it, we learned that we actually had to work very closely with each other, that we were partners in this, that we might bring the political or military oomph, but the European Union, the European community becoming the Union, could bring the economic oomph, which could help draw people together and make them look forward and maybe overcome some of their differences in the former Yugoslavia to get into this more prosperous community of the West, of Europe, of the transatlantic relationship. And that's what we were exploring, defining, and developing through the second half of the 1990s.
You've mentioned several times learning, basically, your own personal process of learning as the times change, your roles change, but also the country learning. And in retrospect, I guess it would be fair to say that we were on a globalization high during that decade.
Right.
Prior to 9/11, in the sense that a lot of what we wanted to achieve in the world, we felt could be done through these economic and social processes and cultural processes that come under the rubric globalization. Talk a little about that. I mean, is my characterization correct?
Well, you know, I think it is. In some way, you can think about the decade of the 1990s as countries shifting from dictatorial, non-market-based systems to sort of the quadrant of democracies or more representative governments and market-based systems. And that's what happened in Central Europe. There were, even in Russia, there was a shift in that direction, and in many other places around the world. In Latin America, a move to democracy. And a lot of that had to do with, at the same time, globalization, because it's globalization of idea flow as well as economics. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you have these negative reactions to globalization, too. The protests against, whether they saw it as multinational corporations or some people, the Americanization of their culture, or even the imposition of foreign ideas, democracy. What are you doing, you know, sending these ideas in here? And that was a lot of what was going on in the 1990s, and a lot of it was happening without many people recognizing it. And it was only as we started getting reactions to it and thinking it through that we sort of saw what was happening. And that great book by Tom Friedman, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, sort of pulled it all together in a very clear and readable way for a lot of people to understand the changes that were taking place in societies because of this globalization. But that meant a lot for our operation of foreign policy also.
Mm-hmm. Then 9/11 came in, and I'm curious. I want to explore some of the interesting tasks that come under your portfolio as a result of 9/11. But I guess your job, that is Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, over and above the difference between a Democratic and a Republican administration, would have been very different in the 90s, even if there would have been a Republican administration before 9/11. Mm-hmm. Talk a little about that. I mean, I know you didn't hold the position then, but what are the really important differences that somebody with the economic portfolio would see because of 9/11?
Well, I think there are two differences that are very important. There are a couple of continuities, which is that global growth is very important. Economic prosperity was always important. Trade and investment were very important already in the 90s. They're very important now. But after 9/11, as we were thinking about some of the things we had been doing and some of the new tasks, all of a sudden we came to the realization that we needed to call some cluster of issues, economic security. And that meant some of the things that are clearly tied to 9/11, like going after the financing of terrorism, or tightening the aviation and maritime security that we have in a way that still allows that transportation, that communication to go forward, but does so in a more secure way. But at the same time, again, it reminded us of the importance of energy security, for example. How many sources of oil and gas are there in the world? Can we develop more sources? What do we need to do to improve the investment climate in some places or to increase the capacity to produce? And then also, we were reminded, well, you know, there are some countries that are really on the front lines of terrorism, and this isn't just a political and a security challenge for them, it has an economic effect. So what can we do to help bolster them economically? One of the very sort of a simple example of that was Pakistan. When we decided that we needed to respond to the Taliban in Afghanistan and go in, Pakistan not only had some political choices to make, but they had the prospect of some of their trade being ended, and trade with us, because they were selling us a lot of textiles. Mm-hmm. So American textile buyers said, oh, this is a war zone, we better shift our production elsewhere. We quickly realized if that happened, you would create more unemployment in Pakistan, that would undermine the government, that would make it harder for them to adopt the right kind of tougher anti-terrorist approach that we wanted. And so we started finding ways to try to both help maintain that textile trade, but help them in economic reform, help them deal with some of their outstanding debt problems. And we did that in several other places around the world. So that's a bit different. The other area that's different is in development policy. Now, this is not solely due to 9/11, but I think you remember in the 9/11 Commission report, they pointed out the importance of having hope for young people in the Islamic world, job creation, prosperity, trade, investment. That meant that we really needed to think differently about development policy. It's not that there's a direct link, development policy and right, prosperity to terrorism, but you know that if you don't have the hope of a prosperous life, people are liable to be maybe enticed more easily off into other more radical options. So we started some very serious rethinking of our development policy, requesting authorization for some really pretty radical new programs in development and for new monies. In the first 3 years of President Bush's administration, we increased our development assistance by 60%. Mm-hmm. We have a new program called the Millennium Challenge Account, mm-hmm, which is aimed at reinforcing those countries who are doing the best possible with their existing resources. And so there's been a lot of rethinking going on in that area, realizing that it is important for America in the world.
President Bush, I guess, has a two-pronged agenda to simplify his policy. One falls under the notion of preemption or prevention, acting before the terrorists act. And then the other is really transformation, mm-hmm, you know, and these two of the things that you mentioned actually each seem to be a prong of that. So let's talk a little about how somebody with your portfolio in a way does deal in a funny kind of way with preemption in this agenda of stopping the financing of the terrorists there. what's the problem, so to speak? I mean, we know what the problem is. They're getting money and doing these, but then once you are given that job and roll up your sleeves, what are the things that you come up against? That the privacy laws, the unwillingness of corporations to disclose the movement of funds, or is it rather traditional organizations, the way Islamic charities do their financing and operate so different from modern institutions? I've thrown a lot at you, but I do want to help people understand, what the nuts and bolts are of implementing this. Yeah.
Well, it's those things and a bit more.
Yeah.
One of the items to remember about in the financing of terrorism is that it doesn't take a lot of money to finance terrorism. So it's not like drug trade, where all of a sudden you've got millions and millions of dollars floating around that you can find. It is small amounts of money getting to certain individuals at the right time in the right place. And so, in a sense, what you have from the task of those trying to stop it is a much more complex challenge, where you need to bring intelligence information, law enforcement information, together with financial information, and then diplomatic and other means to talk to other governments and get cooperation to act in a timely way. And since most of this money is not flowing through the United States, you do need a coalition of countries and good partners who are willing to work with you and make some of these same hard organizational shifts that are required to really track the money and track the individuals. In doing that, we have discovered that there are certain institutions that need to be changed. In a lot of Islamic charities, there was no supervision going on. It didn't mean that most of the money going into the Islamic charities were going to terrorism. It wasn't. It was going to good deeds. And there were good people who were giving and good people who were trying to disperse it around the world. But some of it and some of the organizations were being abused by people. And there wasn't tight scrutiny. In fact, we learned all over the world there was perhaps not as tight scrutiny as we would have liked in charitable operations, Islamic or non-Islamic. So we needed to look at that. We needed to look at the rules and the norms and the standards that we set for things like wire transfers, the transparency that was required to know who sent the money to whom. So we started working in an organization called the Financial Action Task Force, which is in Paris, with about 30 countries, to start defining norms for the wire transfers, norms for charitable oversight, norms for knowing your customer, and building up a consensus internationally of how to go forward. Now, at the same time, we were going after individual terrorists and individual terrorist groups and their networks to try to cut off that financing. Some of this was public. Some of it we've done through the United Nations, and one of the very effective tools that we had was a United Nations resolution which established a list of Taliban and Al-Qaeda supporters, and if your name or group was on that list, everybody in the UN was obliged to freeze your funds and prevent you from traveling and block any arms sales. But there were many things that were happening that of course weren't public also. Other kind of actions that went on. So it's really been a broad-based campaign, a campaign where we've been learning, as I mentioned earlier, as we go forward to try and get smarter about doing this, where we've been trying to get more partners to work with us, and that sometimes means helping those partners have the capacity to do the same things we can do in their own country. And so there's been a lot of good progress, but there's a lot more to do ahead of us.
This problem seems to invite a discussion of what we were talking about earlier, namely that some of your negotiations are really within the government, within the U.S. government itself, because I would assume that in undertaking these tasks, you have encountered some of the very problems that the 9/11 Commission talked about, namely the sharing of data within agencies of the American government, breaking out of routines that are well established, and so on. Without asking you to, name names or anything, I'm just curious. How do you move the process along? I mean, is it that everybody everybody realizes we've got a new problem, and is that the primary thing? What are your resources to make changes when the president can't be in the room, presumably, at every one of these meetings to make people respond to what needs to be done?
Right. Well, I think, as the 9/11 Commission has pointed out, there were serious problems in interagency coordination and sharing of information in the whole counterterrorism area. And it was certainly true in the terrorist financing area, too. But after 9/11, we, for the first time, brought a group together whose main responsibility, sole responsibility, was to look at terrorist financing. And we brought the Treasury Department and the National Security Department and the State Department and the law enforcement and intelligence communities and the Justice Department. And we started learning by making ourselves sit down together and work on the targets, the groups, the individuals that were out there, the norms that we wanted to establish to get another country to cooperate. And through that process, we actually hammered out a very good set of practices interagency. And so if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, their report is actually pretty positive on what we've done so far. It's not, nowhere was perfect, but they did a special annex on terrorist financing, and they said, well, these guys are making a serious effort here.
Now, what about the allies and potential allies that you have to also bring to the table in these negotiations? Because let's talk about two problems here. One is our traditional allies. If you were trying to do this in the 80s, it would have been much easier. If you were trying to do it in the 90s, it probably would have been harder even to convince the Europeans about some of this, but it's still easier than it may be. Not after 9/11 so much, but after the U.S. foreign policy has taken decision which some of what has been called the old Europe has disagreed with. So my question is do we still see cooperation with our traditional allies despite the political differences about some of the choices that the administration has made?
Yes. There's been no spillover from the disagreement on some other foreign policy areas to terrorist financing. We've had very close cooperation. There are challenges in a number of countries, for example, getting their various ministries who handle different parts of this problem to talk with each other is still a challenge.
So the same problem that we have here.
It's the same problem that we have, except since they were not the subject of an attack, they weren't sort of forced to knock heads together.
Right.
And so there's a lot of persuasion, a lot of hard work, a lot of showing best examples and encouraging people to come together. That's in our traditional allied capitals. In other places around the world, in South Asia, in the Middle East, in East Asia, there's just a capacity problem. They don't have enough trained people often to do the forensic work needed to trace money. Their law enforcement officials are focused just on trying to track the terrorists down, let alone find the financiers. And so there's a lot of space there, which we are doing in other members of the G8, to give them capacity building assistance. The IMF and the World Bank are also working on this, just so they can carry out a number of the basic tasks and help out.
Are there also, without naming countries, are there also political challenges? Because there's enough in the press to believe that in some countries there are that parts of the government may be intertwined with terrorist organization, not necessarily allies, but at least not wanting to expose different parts of the society. So what do we do about those kinds of connections where it's not a bureaucratic or a learning education, but really political resistance to going all the way and stopping the financing?
Right. Well, we try to persuade. And this is a real challenge for diplomacy and for showing people why it's in their interest to cooperate with us. And sometimes you're right that there are political alignments within a society or a government that makes it hard for people without very crystal clear evidence to actually act against a certain group or certain interests. But then at the same time, we do stress that if there is not cooperation on a number of these areas, then we won't be able to cooperate with them on things that they want, or maybe provide them the kind of assistance that they need. Mm-hmm. Now, we try and do this, of course, in the quiet of non-public discussion, mm-hmm. because that's the most effective way to go forward. With some governments, of course, for many years we haven't been able to have that kind of approach, and we have a whole program where we've named states as state supporters of terrorism. And that was the main focus when I did work on counterterrorism previously in my career. And as you know, Iran and Syria and North Korea mm-hmm. and others are still in that category for us. And those are countries where we just haven't been able to get any degree of meeting of the minds on the fight against terrorism. Mm-hmm. But in many other places, we are able to persuade people, and we try and move them step by step in the right direction. And sometimes we get some additional steps that we would like, and sometimes we get frustrated and have to try and think through new ways to go forward.
And I guess you just mentioned, that some of this is done behind closed doors. I guess that in a democracy, making foreign policy and the relationship of the media to all of that is awfully complicated, because throughout your career there's been quite an evolution of the respect for the secrecy needed to do the work of the job, mm-hmm. to get things done. So it's hard work, I guess one would have to say, as you're on the verge of a successful negotiation that potentially is leaked before all the ducks are in the row, which blows the whole thing out of the water.
Well, certainly, I think we've increasingly learned in recent years that we have to have a public diplomacy aspect to everything we do. We have to have a plan for explaining what we're doing or what we aren't able to do. At a minimum, Congress will be asking us, well, why haven't you gotten this country to cooperate? So you need to keep Congress informed, keep the press informed, even if you're quietly negotiating at the same time. And you have to be ready for these leaks, as you say, that come out, and to say, well, this is what we're trying to do, and that's as far as I can tell you right now, or this is where we're going. Mm-hmm. But you're right that in this information era, we need to be more information savvy. And that requires new skills. And hopefully some of us have learned those new skills, though it's something that we didn't have initially. And we have been trying to get better at it. And that's true all around the world, of course. And it's very important. I mean, it's good to have this information out there flowing. It has all sorts of positive ramifications for people around the world really knowing what's going on. Mm-hmm. But it does give us some challenges, no question.
Now, the other broad component of President Bush's strategy is the transformation of societies, mm-hmm. whether there's a military occupation or not. And the administration, as you said, started even before 9/11 developing this Millennium Challenge account. We had actually Steve Krasner from Stanford on the program, and we actually talked a little about this. And as I was reading a speech that you gave recently about the Millennium Challenge, it struck me that in some way what you're trying to do is not unlike European enlargement or components of European enlargement, in the sense that you're defining criteria that justify aid in our case, but in their case, membership in the EU. So talk a little about that, because what you have here is in kind of a non-war situation, a non-occupation situation. The U.S. negotiating with potential failed states to say, look, here's a list, you've got to do these things. Once we check off the list, we're in a position to receive aid from the United States. Is that a fair statement of what you're trying to do, and talk a little about it?
Yes, we are. That's the direction in which we have moved. This thinking really came out of in 2001 and 2002. We started looking at development policy, and we said, well, you know, we've got 40 years now of history of giving money to poorer countries and helping them develop, but the record isn't that great. So what are we doing wrong? Is all this focus on official development assistance need to be fine-tuned, and do we need to look at other things? And there was actually a UN gathering in Monterrey, Mexico, a summit on development, and that helped us with that goal out there, and we knew that everybody was going to be looking at it. As usual, some people would just have the option of pouring more money in without thinking it through. We said we have to be smarter about this. What have we learned? What can we learn? And so we started with a very simple notion. Well, it's not just money, it's how you use the money. And with those countries that have actually transformed themselves and done well, what's common? What have they done well? And so we came up with the notion, and that President Bush blessed, that you really need to look at what countries are doing to govern their people justly, what they're doing to care for their people, investing in their people, and then what they're doing to free up the economy. Because, and this was based on the notion that those countries that have really taken off are countries that have gotten their own economic system running. They've traded with others. Their entrepreneurs have grown. They've gotten foreign investment. So when all those things come together, and of course you can't do that unless you've educated people and they're healthy, and then to the degree that you have, of course, good governance, you've limited corruption or worked against corruption, you have representational systems, you have voice and vote freedoms, all of that, where that comes together, you've really seen a big takeoff for countries. So we put that all together into a proposal called the Millennium Challenge Account, and we said, okay, let's reward these poor countries that are doing the best in these areas with their limited resources. So it's sort of like rewarding the best students in the class. And the proposal was, okay, we'll set up these objective indicators. They're indicators that the United States doesn't do, but the World Bank does, or Transparency International does, or the IMF does. We'll see how all these countries rank, and those countries that rank above the median in these areas, we will offer them the possibility of additional assistance from the United States. And we argue that this has to be additional assistance. We don't want to take away from the development aid that's going to the poorest countries that have disasters that need help, or that are helping to establish a civil society in a certain other country. We want to have an additional slice on top of that. And this came in the context of, for the first time in the national security strategy of the United States, having development as one of the pillars of national security. So understanding that and arguing to Congress and to others, this is important for our security. It's not just that we're being nice. We are being nice, but we're being nice in our own interest, too. And so President Bush put forward the proposal. Congress passed the proposal in January of this year, and we've now launched for the first time this effort. We have an independent corporation within the government. Chairman of the board is the Secretary of State, with the Secretary of Treasury and others on the board, the trade representative. And they are now in the process. They've now collected project proposals from the first 16 countries that were chosen as being the best students in class, so to speak. They're now negotiating with those countries. And one of the interesting things we're going to do as this goes forward is you're really going to have something like a business plan. We're calling them a compact, where you set out goals and objectives. And unless you meet those benchmarks, you're not going to get the assistance along the way. So it's a really interesting experiment. And we're seeing many more people around the world now interested in this. One of the reasons I'm out here is that we're having a conference that's in San Francisco called Eradicating Eradicating Poverty Through Profit. And the idea here is to get the private sector more involved in reaching out to the poorest people at the bottom of the pyramid and involving them and encouraging their entrepreneurship. So there's a lot of new thinking going on in the development area.
Let's talk a little about energy, because you mentioned
Sure.
this earlier and so on, and it seems that in terms of your portfolio, there's really a new importance in assisting, I guess, the finding and building the infrastructure for new sources of oil, in addition to the whole challenges, obviously, in the Persian Gulf as a result of the Iraq War. How does security and economic policy come together in this energy piece of your portfolio in trying to find new sources of oil in places like the Caspian Sea or South Asia, not only finding the oil, but then putting in place the package that would make its extraction and delivery possible?
Sure. Well, there are several different aspects to that. One I might mention to begin with is actually being able to respond to an energy emergency. And in that sense, we work in an international organization called the International Energy Agency. And one of the things we do there with other consuming countries around the world is to make sure that everybody has emergency energy stocks. So if there happened to be a crisis, and the crisis could be because of natural events or violence or something else, that countries have the ability to weather those kind of emergency storms. And so, as you know, the United States has been building up its emergency oil stocks, but so have other countries. And we've been encouraging new consumers like China to develop the same kind of stocks and to have that ability to weather those short-term emergencies. Secondly, we have put a great deal of effort into areas like the Caspian Basin. And we have worked very hard not to preempt the decision of private sector oil companies, but to help foster dialogue between the governments of the region for their own mutual benefit, to be able to deal with all those cross-border issues that make pipelines, whether they be natural gas or oil pipelines, possible. And so we've had a special high representative for a number of years, different ones. In fact, Beth Jones, who you interviewed earlier a couple of years ago, used to do that, and we have another ambassador now that does it. And the idea is to facilitate the agreement between companies and governments to help make it possible for those petroleum reserves to leave that region. Similarly, in other corners of the world, if it's Africa, West Africa, much development going on there, or Latin America, we try to encourage the governments to take steps that will improve the investment climate in those countries. And we're arguing very much that it's, of course, in their interest to do that too, because it will bring the potential of much more wealth to those countries. And then an interesting other angle that we've taken is to work to find ways to increase transparency and thus limit the opportunities for corruption in those countries. So that when money arrives from a company to a government, it actually gets from that government to specific projects to help the people in the country. Because, of course, one of the main criticisms, not only from Western NGOs, but in those countries, is, well, we aren't getting the results of all this wealth. Where is it going? And we realize that in the long run, that's not conducive to a good supply of energy or stability in that part of the world. So we're working hard on that too.
One gets a sense that there is a part of the government that is moving along very rationally, trying to adopt procedures that would combine, for example, issues like economic development with equity and stability and so on the one hand, getting energy resources. But one has a sense that the world is very much like Berkeley was when you were here, a lot messier. In the sense that, for example, in the example you're talking about, the Caspian Basin and South Asia, you suddenly confront ethnic conflict, which crosses these borders. You confront human rights issues. So you're dealing with a government that you want oil from, but there may be human. So I'm just I'm not asking you to settle all this, which, you know, is a lifetime's work, but I guess what I'm curious about is what in your work, building on your background, the ideas that matter to you. We know that you confronted messes like this when Berkeley was being radicalized in the 60s. How do you sort all this out? I mean, where does hope lie? And then how do you continue moving the process along? Because in the long term, you know, this is the right way to go. I think that's fairly clear. But in the short term, there are a lot of contradictions in what you're doing that you may, because politics is about making choices, and the choices and the goals conflict, and you have to weigh, well, which is more important? Talk about that a little, and how you sort that out as a diplomat.
Well, you're exactly right that there are a lot of problems along the way, a lot of fires, and a lot of frustration that sometimes we think we've got something worked out, and then a government will take a decision and, oh no, we want to revisit that. Or they'll do something for other reasons that, as you say, affect the human rights situation or affect the stability or the relations with their neighbors. And so part of the challenge is, one, keeping that long-term vision in mind, and then trying to be creative in finding ways to deal with the best of whatever you're facing at that moment. And sometimes we get frustrated and we just say, okay, we have to wait. Not that we're frustrated, but we can't move it forward for a month or two, or we'll just have to wait until things cool off. Other times, we're able to come at it from other angles, to get some other partners to work with us, to persuade people to move forward. Sometimes it just takes getting all the people to talk to each other and to sit down and calmly discuss things. And that usually doesn't mean that we're in the room, but it might mean we've talked to both sides and tried to coax them to get together. But you're right, it calls on often all the wisdom that we can possibly pull together from our embassies overseas, from our colleagues in other parts of the State Department and other agencies, and revising the tactical plan that we had. Okay, that won't work, so what can we now do to go forward? So I don't mean to give the sense that this is all a smooth flow forward. There are many fits and starts along the way. But in part, that's the work of diplomacy, is to, when you run into those fits, how do you get them to start again?
One final question, and that is, as a graduate of 73, is that?
72.
72.
From Berkeley.
What is your advice to students who will be graduating in 205 and so and on, as to how they should prepare for the kind of work that you've been describing?
Well, I think take advantage of the wide variety of courses that you have here at Berkeley to really learn about the history and the culture of these various countries around the world, but also take some of these courses that really look at human dynamics and how people really interact with each other. And in the words of one of these famous books on negotiation, how you can get to yes.
How do you get to
yes?
Yes.
How do you get to yes? I think that's not only for diplomacy, it's central to diplomacy, but it's central to so much else that we do along the way. And really knowing how you can get there with somebody else to the degree you can in a win-win situation is going to serve you wonderfully in whatever field you go into. But other than that, taking the opportunity to learn about the rest of the world right now is going to serve you very well if you're interested in going forward in the international area.
Tony, on that note, I want to thank you very much for taking the time from your busy schedule to be with us today. Thank you very much.
Harry, thank you. It's a great pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.